Hello, my name is Reverend Chris Howson. I'm the chaplain at the University of Sunderland and part of the Interfaith group. I'm the co-chair of the Interfaith Forum here in Sunderland. Once again, of course, COVID has caused us problems and we haven't been able to meet in the Minster as we normally like to. But we haven't been able to stop making sure that we have something to offer the world on Holocaust Memorial Day. Today, we will hear from Sue Winfield, the Lord Lieutenant of Tyne and Wear, who's been a tireless supporter of the interfaith work in the region. We'll hear from our Deputy Mayor, and we'll hear some singing from Redbury Primary Academy. Looking forward to that immensely. We're enormously grateful for the testimony of Noreen Plen, which you'll be able to listen to in full later on in the broadcast. Thankful also to Judith Thompson from the Sunderland Symphony Orchestra, who'll be performing a piece from Schindler's List. Rabbi Sybil Sheridan will be helping us again with our prayers and acknowledging some of the other atrocities that have happened in the 20th century. We'll be hearing some speakers about other genocides. But we can only do this with the great work of Susan Perryman from the university, who's helped compile this, and of course the tireless work of Tony Waltman in our community. So without further ado, we welcome you to this Holocaust Memorial Day video.
Hello everyone, as Mayor of Sunderland, may I welcome you all to the 2022 Holocaust Memorial Day virtual event. Holocaust Memorial Day is now being held in many cities and towns with Holocaust survivors talking about their experiences. I am proud to say Holocaust Memorial Day has become an annual event here in Sunderland, this evening being its 5th consecutive year and 2nd year as a virtual event, which is all down to the efforts and hard work of everyone at the Sunderland Interfaith Forum. And on behalf of the city, I thank you very much. Without further ado, as Mayor of Sunderland, it gives me great pleasure to open this Holocaust Memorial Day event. Thank you.
Today is a day of remembrance, and I'm grateful as Lord Lieutenant for the opportunity to share my message with you. Holocaust Memorial Day is when we remember those who were persecuted and killed, not only during the Holocaust, but also the Nazi persecution and the many genocides that have followed. And for those caught up in such horrendous atrocities, they could only cope one day at a time and hope that they would survive to the next. And as we remember their horrendous ordeals, we must also hope for a better future. But to do that, we are going to have to work together, learning from the past. So my message is very clear to you all. Whatever our backgrounds, whatever our beliefs, whatever our faiths, please can we work in love and partnership and take action to ensure that we build a better future so that one day there is no more genocide.
The Holocaust, 1941 to 1945. The Holocaust was the systematic and planned attempt by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder all the Jews in Europe. From the time they came into power in Germany in 1933, the Nazis used propaganda, persecution, and legislation to deny human and civil rights to Jews. They used centuries of anti-Semitism as their foundation. After occupying Poland in September 1939, Polish Jews were confined to ghettos. These were areas of appalling living conditions, and the concentration camp was expanded in a deliberate attempt to cause the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews. This approach was repeated across other countries they occupied. In 1941, as part of the final solution, ghettos were liquidated and Jews were transported from across Europe to concentration camps, the largest being Auschwitz-Birkenau. Jews were either sent to work in appalling conditions or they were sent straight to the gas chambers. The Nazis and their collaborators murdered 6 million Jewish people in ghettos, mass shootings, concentration camps, and extermination camps.
Under the leadership of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge seized power in April 1975 and imposed an extremist programme to reconstruct Cambodia. They aimed to remove social classes and Western influences, creating a year zero. The population was made to work as labourers on collective farms, and inhabitants of towns and cities were forced to leave, and people who refused or did not leave quickly were murdered. Ethnic minority groups were targeted, and religion was outlawed. Half the Cham Muslim population was murdered, as were 8,000 Christians, and Buddhism was outlawed. All political and civil rights were abolished. Children were taken from their parents and placed in separate forced labour camps. Factories, schools, universities and hospitals were all shut down. People from any profession were murdered, together with their extended families. It was possible for people to be shot just for knowing a foreign language, wearing glasses, laughing or even crying. One Khmer Rouge slogan said, "To spare you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss." Civilian deaths in this period have been estimated at well over 2 million people.
In 100 days, in 1994, approximately 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were murdered in the genocide in Rwanda. It took place during the decades of tensions between Hutus and Tutsis and recent history of persecution and discrimination against Tutsis. On the 6th of April 1994, the plane carrying Rwanda's president was shot down. I believe that plane also contained Burundi's president, Habyarimana. Extremist Hutu leaders accused Tutsis of killing the president, and Hutu civilians were told by radio and by word of mouth that it was their duty to wipe out Tutsis. Despite its colossal scale, this genocide was carried out almost entirely by hand, usually using machetes and clubs. The men who had been trained to massacre were members of civilian death squads, the Interahamwe, and the state provided support and organisation with politicians, officials, intellectuals and professional soldiers inciting the killers to do their work. Local officials assisted in rounding up victims, and making suitable places available for slaughter. Frequently, the killers were people they knew, neighbours, workmates, former friends, sometimes even relatives through marriage. One young woman told us, "My neighbours armed themselves and began killing the day after President Habib Rahman's plane was shot down." She was a survivor. Her name was Sophie Mazareka. Thank you for listening to yet another story of man's inhumanity to man.
In 1992, Bosnia declared independence from Yugoslavia, but this was resisted by some Bosnian Serbs who wanted to be part of a greater Serbia. Bosnian Serbs were prepared to achieve political domination by isolating ethnic groups and, if necessary, killing them. Under the orders of the president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, the Bosnian Serb leader, Radovan Karadzic, and the Bosnian Serb commander, Ratko Mladic, a campaign of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and genocide was committed by the Bosnian Serb forces. In July 1995, Mladic led Bosnian Serb troops and paramilitaries to capture the town of Srebrenica. When they succeeded, the women and children were forcibly evicted. Over several days, more than 8,000 of the remaining Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, men and boys, or predominantly men and boys, were murdered in and around the town of Srebrenica. Many of their bodies were bulldozed into mass graves and concealed. The genocide at Srebrenica is the largest incidence of mass murder in Europe since 1945. The Bosnian War resulted in the death of around 100,000 people and the displacement of over 2 million people. There are still more than 7,000 missing persons in Bosnia today, and that's more than 25 years on from the war. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this important event to mark the Holocaust, and I look forward to working with you all again. Thank you.
Darfur is a region in the west of Sudan, bordering Chad. In northeast Africa, before the conflict, Darfur had an ethnically mixed population of around 6 million Black Africans and Arabs. In 2003, a conflict began in the region between the population of Black African farmers and the lighter-skinned nomadic Arab population. The Sudanese government, led by the President Omar al-Bashir, began to persecute the Black African population in Darfur. They supported an armed Arab militia, the Janjaweed, who have destroyed hundreds of villages and murdered thousands of people. These atrocities have been condemned as genocide by the International Criminal Court. The conflict has led to the deaths of between 200,000 and 400,000 civilians. Although estimates vary greatly, and this figure could be much higher, international peacekeepers, aid agencies, and media have struggled to keep accurate records, as many are denied the access they need in Sudan. Up to 2.6 million people have been forced from their homes into refugee camps in Darfur, with many more fleeing to neighbouring Chad. Some of those fleeing persecution have sought asylum in the UK.
Hello everyone. I'm very pleased to present to you tonight as part of this very special Holocaust Memorial evening. I will now share my screen and show you the presentation of my missing grandparents and my parents' survival during the Holocaust. Two of the most evil people on the planet were Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. In different ways, my family fell victim to both of them. And through this presentation, the family history will unfold. Sadly, this memorial plaque is the closest I can get to my paternal grandfather. His remains are buried in this mass grave, and I will explain more later about how he died. This gravestone was put up in memory of my mother's parents in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. It's called a symbolic gravestone because their remains are not buried there, but it is a record that they have lived. The words at the bottom translate as homeless ashes of beloved parents. Again, their story I will explain more later. My family all came from Poland, a country that only got its independence on November the 11th, 1918. This day also marked the end of the First World War, Armistice Day. You can see how many borders Poland shares with other countries. Think of Poland as being the filling in a sandwich between Germany and Russia. All my family were displaced unwillingly from their place of birth, solely due to the fact that they were Jewish. And very few survived the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939. First, I will tell you my father's story. He came from an area called Galicia, as shown by the arrow, and a town called Mielec. His father, Shia Kotz, was a deeply religious man. But the family were neither rich nor poor. He was a merchant. He valued education, and he made sure that his 6 children had the opportunity to study secular as well as religious subjects. My grandmother Esther died prematurely in 1925 from heart disease. Out of this whole family, sadly, only 4 survived. My uncle Moshe, who left Poland in 1930 to go to France, my uncle David, his daughter, my cousin Silla, and my father Jan. David, Silla, and Jan will feature in this presentation. Life in the town was centered around the large cobblestone market. In the period preceding World War II, life was tough for the Jews. Heavy taxes were imposed on Jewish businesses. Some priests preached boycott in the churches, and children were forbidden from taking part in sports competitions or school plays. The 1930s had brought about a rise of nationalism and anti-Semitism, and this was especially prevalent in the smaller towns. But things were only going to become worse. And tension continued to mount in Mielec until Germany invaded Poland by land and air on September the 1st, 1939. This was followed 2 days later by Britain and France declaring war, and the Second World War had started. When war broke out, my father was 30 years of age, his older brother David was 38, and Silla was 11. She survived the war on her own as a young teenager and is now age 93 and living in Toronto. By September the 8th, the German army had taken over Mielec. War is the disruption of continuity, and once war started, life changed. Shops closed, there was a shortage of food, Jews were beaten, religious Jews had their beards cut off, and they were forced to perform demeaning tasks like you see in this slide. scrubbing the pavement with a brush or even a toothbrush. An awful atrocity occurred only days after the German army had taken over the town. It was the custom of the Jews to go to the bathhouse on the eve of the Sabbath or the eve of any Jewish holiday. And on the eve of the Jewish New Year, 13th of September 1939, the Germans picked up bearded Jews from the street, drove them into the bathhouse, drove the naked Jews who were bathing there and took them all to the slaughterhouse next door where the butchers were working. They doused everyone in kerosene and set them alight. Nobody knows how many people died that night. There were visitors to the town, but the estimate is around 150. And it was soon after this that my father and his brother decided to leave town with the whole family. Initially, they left with David, his wife Erna, his two children, Silla and Hania, and my father with his young wife, Dora. Out of the 4 women, Silla was the only one to survive. Here is an excerpt of those times spoken by my Uncle David.
When the war broke out, after a few days, we heard rumors that the German army is approaching our town. It was known that at that time that men are in very great danger, except the women. Everybody was sure that the women are more careful and sure with their life. So, as I had a very good friend amongst the Christians, one of my friends, he told me, "Don't worry, Mr. Kurtz, I'll give you my lorry for your luggage." And for this, he gave me his private car, and we ran from the town with the whole family. And he didn't take in account that in a war, you can go only a few miles with this fuel. When he got far away from LHD, so that there is no fuel to get. So we went to a small town where one of our aunts lived, and there we stopped. We spent the night in my aunt's house, and then we were aware that the Polish army is retreating. So we knew that we are again in great danger to be captured by the Germans. So my wife told me, "You know, David, you run, we'll remain." We took horses with the wagon, and we went away. When
David and Jan left the women and children behind, still believing that the Germans would not harm them. And how wrong this was, but it was a common belief at the time. They reached the Polish town of Lvov and saw that it was under Russian control. And this gave them mixed feelings because they were unsure about life under the communists, but also knew that they were safe from the Nazis. How come the Russians were in control of this part of Poland? It was due to this tongue twister, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, one of several pacts and treaties signed even before the war had started. It was signed by the foreign ministers of Russia and Germany, signed in Moscow on August 23rd, 1939. And the plan was to secretly divide Europe on a map. And they were following the lines of the 3 Polish rivers, the Narew, the Vistula, and the River San. And Lvov was just on the Russian side of this dividing line. under Russian control. The brothers lived in Lvov for nearly a year before they were arrested because they had refused to take Soviet citizenship. Together with 76,000 other Polish Jewish men, they were arrested on the 29th of June 1940 and loaded into cattle trucks. It is commonly known that the Germans used cattle trucks to transport prisoners under inhumane conditions, but this method was also used by the Russians. It was at this stage that the two brothers were separated, and it would be 6 long years before either knew the fate of the other, nor knew the fate of the rest of the family. You will now hear my father's words of those times.
These are the words of my grandfather, Jan. After 2 weeks, we were transported in cattle trucks deep into Russia, a journey that took 2 weeks. Conditions during the journey were terrible. 1 bucket of water was supplied daily for 80 people. There were no sanitary facilities and no ventilation. There was no space to sit or lie. Older people collapsed and room had to be made for them on the floor, increasing the congestion. We were only given a little bread, water and sugar each day. Conditions in the labour camp were primitive, beyond my imagination, and I thought survival impossible. We were all subjected to interrogations, and inmates were deprived of all personal possessions, even photographs of loved ones. Temperatures during winter months dropped to 45 degrees centigrade below zero, sometimes colder, and camp clothing was totally inadequate for these awful conditions. Work continued 7 days a week. All inmates were given arduous physical tasks regardless of their health and strength. This included tree cutting in the forests and heavy labouring during the building of the Volga Canal. Malnutrition had a disastrous effect on many people, including the young. Death from exhaustion and starvation was not uncommon.
45 degrees below zero is unbelievably cold, even for Siberia. And many men died. There were epidemics of dysentery, typhoid, and malaria. And my father told me that morale was rock bottom. I believe he never knew the exact location of his labor camp, but it was somewhere in a remote area of Siberia. Prisoners were given meager rations of bread and a few cigarettes each day. And my father was willing to trade in his cigarettes for extra bread, and this undoubtedly helped to save his life. It also gave him a lifelong hatred of smoking, as he saw men so addicted to nicotine they preferred to smoke rather than eat, and of course they died sooner. At some stage while in Siberia, my father Jan was accused by the NKVD, a secret police agency in the Soviet Union dealing with law enforcement, of a trumped-up charge and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. This would cause him a problem later. When Germany invaded Russia in June 1941, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact broke down, and a new pact was signed in London between Russia and Poland on the 30th of July 1949. The Polish government were in exile in London at the time, which is why you can see Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden sitting at the table. This Sikorsky-Maysky Pact helped my father in 2 ways. All the previous prison sentences handed down by the Soviet courts could not be put into effect. And there was an amnesty for all Polish prisoners in the Soviet Union, including the Jews. But news travelled slowly, and my father wasn't released till sometime in the spring of 1942 in very poor physical shape. He travelled south to the warmer climate of Georgia and spent some time in a sanatorium recovering his strength. While David and Jan were in Russia, my grandfather had been left behind in Mielec. On one single day, the Nazis destroyed the entire Mielec Jewish community, and only a handful of Jews have lived there since. On March the 9th, 1942, the Nazis rounded up and deported all the Jews from the town. When they got to the woods on the edge of the town, they shot and murdered a few hundred of the oldest and weakest. And my grandfather was one of those. He was 64 years old. Back in Russia, my father has recovered his strength, and we find him in the uniform of a private in the Berlin Army. The Berlin Army, or the Polish First Army, was part of the Russian Red Army, made up of Poles in Russia. And this was the army that helped to liberate Warsaw in 1945. At that stage, my father left the army and he got a job working in the Ministry of the Interior. While he was working there, my mother became his secretary, and that is how they met. But how come my mother was in Warsaw? Before I tell you that, I'll tell you about one of the roles my father had in the Ministry of the Interior, was looking after German prisoners of war, including the notorious Hans Frank, known as the Butcher of Poland. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Frank was appointed Governor General of the Polish occupied territories, and he was also Hitler's legal advisor. During his tenure, nothing happened in Poland without his approval, and he became directly involved in the mass murder of Jews. One day, my father was given a loaded gun and told to go into the interview room and interview him. I remember my father telling me, I looked into his eyes and he was already a dead man. And of course, he did not shoot. And as I mentioned before, my mother became his secretary, and I will now tell you my mother's story. My mother was part of the Waxman family. My grandfather, Isaac, Grandma Nesha. My grandfather owned a hardware shop. The family were not terribly religious, but were traditional, and they had 3 children who luckily all survived. When war broke out, my uncle Marek was in Palestine studying agriculture. My mum Lola was at university, and her younger sister Ludka had just finished school. The family lived in a town called Lublin. You can see the cobblestone street, it was called Grodzka. And this arch at the end is called the Grodzka Gate, or the Jewish Gate. And the Jewish area was on the far side of this gate, but it was totally destroyed and is now a car park. This is the same street when I visited Poland in 2017. I was so lucky that apparently my mum and her family lived on the predominantly non-Jewish side, which meant that the houses where they were born were still standing and I was able to visit them. The family moved to Warsaw in 1934, where my grandfather started a business importing tea and coffee. They led a very happy life, a comfortable existence, but this was totally disrupted and changed forever when the Germans took over the city. The German army attacked Warsaw on day 6 of the war, and life changed very quickly. There was a siege which lasted nearly 4 weeks until the Polish army was defeated and Warsaw fell. Living conditions deteriorated very quickly, as in every other occupied town. Here you see a picture of a building which became part of the Warsaw Ghetto. Ghettos were created in several Polish towns, and they were areas that were closed off and isolated the Jews from the non-Jewish population in very poor conditions. On October the 1st, 1939, only days after Warsaw fell, my mother Lola, sister Ludka, and their parents were forcibly removed from their comfortable apartment in Graniczna Street to this rundown building in Ogrodowa Street, number 10. And they were given very little notice to move, so weren't able to take many of their possessions with them. My mum and her sister were then forced into slave labor, working 10 to 12 hours a day in a factory under jail-like conditions. And they had to walk to work because Jews were forbidden from riding on any form of public transport. And they had to wear a white armband. From November 1939, all Jews had to be identified by wearing a white armband, 10 centimeter wide, with a blue 6-sided star embroidered on them. This had to be worn on the right-hand sleeve of their outer garment. Later on, as more countries were occupied, Jews had to wear the more familiar yellow star with the word Jew in German or the local language in the middle. Wearing a badge, it's designed to make the wearer conspicuous and denote separation from the rest of society. And none of us would feel comfortable walking down the street marked out as different. When the Germans, using Jewish labor, started building a wall around the town, nobody knew what was happening at first. But then on November the 15th, 1940, they closed off the Warsaw Ghetto to the outside world. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest of all the ghettos in Poland, and at its height, 460,000 Jews were trapped in there. Life was incredibly hard. Living conditions were miserable. Families were forced to live together in one room and sometimes had to share with another family. Food, medicine, clothing, everything was scarce. The Nazis allowed only 184 calories a day, food allowance for a non-worker. This is the equivalent of 1 chocolate biscuit. As a result, 80% of the food was smuggled into the ghetto, mainly by young children. But many people died from starvation or typhus. In July 1942, my mum and her sister were moved from the factory to working in the shop. The same month, the Nazis started deporting the ghetto Jews to the death camp of Treblinka, and 265,000 Jews were taken there over the next 8 weeks. It was at this stage that my mum and her sister hatched a plan to escape. First, they had to organize a safe place on the Aryan side. The Aryan side was the non-Jewish side of Warsaw. While working in the shop, they had met a Polish lorry driver who had permission to bring potatoes into the ghetto. And one day, and before they left, they also had to organize a safe place. I've mentioned that. One day in January 1943, the two sisters were hidden in an empty lorry, covered with tarpaulins, and driven out of the ghetto to the Aryan side. Had they been discovered, they would all have been shot. So it was a huge risk for all of them. And the saddest and hardest thing is that the two sisters had to leave their parents behind, and they never saw them again. After another wave of deportations in January 1943, a few different groups of young Polish fighters decided to unite and resist. For months, a group of mainly young women had been smuggling weapons from around the country into the ghetto. And the fighters had notice of an impending attack. And by this stage, there were only 60,000 Jews left in the ghetto. So they ordered everyone into their pre-prepared bunkers. On the eve of the Jewish Passover, 19th of April, 1943, the German army entered the ghetto with the intention of liquidating it. And they were met by armed resistance. And this revolt is known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. On the first two occasions the German army came in, they were attacked and they were so surprised that they turned around and fled, leaving valuable weapons behind. Machine guns, grenades, which the ghetto fighters took with glee. And then the Germans brought in reinforcements. And despite there being only 750 young Jewish fighters, they fought the might of the German army, using any weapons they could lay their hands on. And the uprising lasted an incredible 4 weeks, until the 16th of May, 1943, when the Germans prevailed, at which stage they destroyed the whole of the ghetto. And had my mum and her sister not escaped in January, they would not have survived. So what happened next to mum and her sister? The lorry driver took the two girls to a pre-arranged farm on the outskirts of Warsaw, where the farmer had been paid to allow the two girls to work on his land. The farmer's wife helped the sisters to dye their hair blonde. She taught them the responses of the Catholic Church, and they changed their names to take on the persona of two Catholic girls. My mother, Lola Waxman, became Teresa Zaremba, and my aunt, Ludka Waxman, became Ludmila Waleska. They were on the farm working one day when they heard in the village that the Germans were coming, so they asked the farmer to hide them, which he did. When they thanked him afterwards, he said to them, "Don't think I like you Jews, but I need your labor." And it was sometime after that they left the farm and they went back to Warsaw working as Polish maids. But very often they had to run for their lives as they were denounced by the families they were working with. And it was only by a combination of swift sisterly communication, incredible good luck, they stayed one step ahead of both the Polish police and the Gestapo. They were very frightened. It was a very difficult time. And at some stage, they actually went back to the farm. 1945 comes, the war ends, things improve a bit, but Poland is still under Russian control and life is not the same. My mum and her sister came back from the farm, and it was at this stage that she got a job as a secretary in the Ministry of the Interior, working for a man called Jan Bernstein, my father. This slide shows my parents soon after they met. My mum was 27 and my father was 36. During 1946-47, my father was aware that his phone was being tapped, his post was being disturbed, and he reckoned the NKVD were watching him. Do you remember that prison sentence which he never fulfilled? So my parents decided to leave Poland. This was easier said than done. They had both lost all their documents during the war, but they managed to get copy birth certificates. And in December 47, they got married in a joint ceremony with my mum's sister Lutka and her new husband, Lolek. In 1948, the two couples managed to leave Poland illegally on false passports. They traveled first to Prague and then to Paris, and my father escaped the Russians once again. After living in Paris for several months, my parents emigrated again, this time to England, to Newcastle upon Tyne. My mum's brother Marek was living here and he arranged a work permit for my father so they could enter the country legally. And they lived in Newcastle, where I was born, and where they could live in safety and security. The Nazis tried to kill every Jew in Europe under the cover of the Second World War. In 1939, there were 3 million Jews in Poland and just over 10% survived. My father was one of 6% who survived in Russia or other European countries. My mother was one of only 4% who survived in Poland under German occupation, and she was one of 185 survivors of the 460,000 in the Warsaw Ghetto. Their legacy is their 2 grandchildren, who are now adults and between them have 5 children of their own. But let me finish where I started, my grandparents. What had happened to my mother's parents? Well, sometime after January 1943, they were discovered hiding in an underground bunker in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were arrested. They were taken to a forced labor camp called Trawniki, about 20 kilometers from Lublin. In October, the prisoners were ordered to dig zigzag trenches. And on November the 3rd, 1943, they were marched to the killing site, forced to strip, made to lie down in the trenches, and machine gunned to death. 10,000 Jews altogether. During this time, loudspeakers played music, the Germans trying to hide the sound of the shots and the screams. My maternal grandparents died in Trawniki on November the 3rd, 1943. They were 50 years old. In 2017, my husband and I visited Mielec. No trace of my paternal grandparents. The cemeteries had been destroyed. All the records had been destroyed, and there's no trace of them having ever lived. I don't even know what they look like. But I have this photo of my maternal grandparents, Isaac and Nesha. It makes me feel very sad that I never knew them, but I'm very lucky to have it, and I can see family resemblances. They are 2 out of 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Second World War. In my immediate family, we're not even sure exactly how many, but we think about 80 members of the family were murdered. I knew very little about my Polish family and had to do a huge amount of research to enable me to give this presentation. This is why oral memories handed down from the generations are so important. And we must all try and remember to talk to the older members of our own families to learn our own history before it is too late. Many other groups were also murdered in large numbers due to racism, intolerance, prejudice, and they include the Roma and the Sinti, people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, political prisoners. I hope my grandchildren grow up in a world without prejudice and stand up and speak out if they come across bullying or unfairness in school or elsewhere. Prejudice means prejudge, and we should never do that just because someone is different from us. Following the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day, One Day, I hope you noticed some critical dates during my presentation, and maybe we'll go home and think of some critical dates in your own lives. Thank you for listening.
We remember our 6 million dead, who died when violence ruled the world and evil dwelt on earth. We remember those we knew and those whose very name is lost. We mourn for all that died with them, their goodness and their wisdom, which could have saved the world and healed so many wounds. We mourn for the genius and the wit that died, the learning and the laughter that were lost. The world has become a poorer place and our hearts become cold as we think of the splendor that might have been. We stand in gratitude for their example of decency and goodness. They are like candles which shine out from the darkness of those years, and in their light we know what goodness is and evil. We salute those men and women who were not Jews, who had the courage to stand outside the mob and suffer with us. They too are your witnesses, a source of hope when we despair. May such times never come again, and may our sacrifice not be in vain. In our daily fight against cruelty and prejudice, against tyranny and persecution, their memory gives us strength and leads us on. In silence, we remember those who sanctified your name on earth. Hail Male Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamatzei Menucha Nochona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'malot Kedoshim Utechorim, Kezohar Kia Maxirim, L'nishmot 6 million Acheinu v'Achotenu, Shemetu al Kiddush Hashem, Yanachu b'shalva v'shalom, Shelo yadu b'chayechem. Ana bal harachamim, Hastireim b'seita kenafecha le'olamim, Utzru b'tzru hachayim et nishmatam, Adonai hu nachalatam, V'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavam, V'noma Amen. God, full of compassion, whose presence is over us, may the souls of our 6 million dead who have gone to their everlasting home with the holy and pure on high, who shine as the lights of heaven, find the safety and rest denied them on earth, beneath the shelter of your presence. Source of mercy, cover them in the shelter of your wings forever, and bind their souls into the gathering of life. It is God who is their heritage. May they be at peace, and let us say, Amen. The Mourner's Kaddish, which is read to commemorate all those who have died, does not speak of death at all, but only affirms the reality and the existence of God, and is full of praise for the Creator. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, bi'almadi v'rahirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yomechon, u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, b'agalav izman kari v'yimru Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah m'varach leolam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ah v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitada v'yitalei v'yitalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Le'ela min kol bechata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, di'amiran be'alma v'yimru Amen. Yehei shalom Rabba bin Shemaiah, v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Osei shalom b'mromav, hu ya'asei shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol ha'olam v'yimru Amen. Let us magnify and let us sanctify in this world the great name of God, whose will created it. May God's reign come in your lifetime and in your days, and in the lifetime of the family of Israel. Quickly and speedily may it come. May the greatness of God's being be blessed from eternity to eternity. Let us bless and let us extol. Let us tell aloud and let us raise aloft. Let us set on high and let us honor. Let us exalt and let us praise the Holy One, whose name is blessed, who is far beyond any blessing and song, any honor or any consolation that can be spoken of in this world. May great peace from heaven and the gift of life be granted to us and to all the family of Israel. May the Maker of peace in the highest bring this peace upon us, upon all the family of Israel, and upon all the world. And let us say, Amen.
Well, can I just say a huge heartfelt thanks from myself and Zaf, the co-chairs of the Interfaith Forum, from Tony, our Jewish coordinator, and from all at SIF. A big thank you to all who've sat down and taken part in this, contributed and watched it. We're very grateful, and we really sincerely hope that this time next year we're able to meet together in the Minster or some other place, but together. We really hope that. We tend to finish all our events and services with a moment of stillness or prayer, and I've chosen just to end with the International Prayer for Peace, which is often used at interfaith gatherings. So just be mindful of these words as we close our commemoration today. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. And let peace fill our hearts, our world, our universe. Let us dream together, pray together, work together to build one world of peace and justice for all. Amen.